If you were to take out the whiteboard and sort of do the whole web of where all of these companies exist in the supply chain, where does Micron sit?
Yeah, Micron is a pretty critical supplier in terms of not just AI, but they're pretty ubiquitous across all sorts of consumer electronics and PCs, smartphones, all those different products. So one area, we've focused a lot on AI recently. AI is certainly one of the major drivers of price increases. However, some of the reasons for upward estimate revisions recently for Micron, and obviously with this very strong outlook, is actually just driven by the fact that there's a limited amount of supply in the market, and so AI is sort of exacerbating the situation. But as long as there's fairly strong demand for products like consumer products, PCs, smartphones, that can actually drive price increases as well, not just AI.
So it's not just stronger demand, it's that the cost of what they sell has gone up.
Right? Yeah, right. So, I mean, if you look at some of the spot contract pricing, it's gone up quite a bit. Now, contract pricing is probably the more key metric to look at. But if you look at DDR5, for example, between January of this year.
What's DDR5?
It's the most recent sort of generation of products that they sell that's DRAM based. Most of their revenue now, at 80+%, is generated from DRAM versus NAND, which is more like your storage products like SSDs, stuff like that. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting. I mean, I'm going to the supply chain function, which we always love on the Bloomberg, but NVIDIA is about 16% of their revenue. Apple's about 4%. WPG Holdings is the biggest, it looks like. They're about 9.8% of their holdings. But that they are being able to charge more, is that why margin has gone up so much? I mean, it explains so many of the metrics here then.
Yeah. So margins are really heavily impacted by pricing. So obviously there's sort of input cost, and in the last downturn, as pricing started to collapse, you saw gross margins, operating margins get razor thin. But now as we're starting to see supply crunches, the exact opposite's happening. One of the key reasons that this is occurring actually is because high bandwidth memory requires more wafers than a traditional DRAM die. And so it's going from 1:1 to 3:1, and then with HBM4 it's actually going to about 4:1. So as demand shifts over to AI, it's taking away from capacity for traditional products, which is exacerbating, as I pointed before, the supply situation. The major reason for price increases, because we have seen PC, smartphone refresh cycles.
So we pay more. So everybody pays more.
Everyone pays more.
Because they have the power to charge more. The margin's close to 70%.
Yeah, no, that's the thing. The gross margins are directly related to supply demand. High bandwidth memory does have higher margins than the standard products, but we're actually starting to get into an environment where the standard products have very strong margins as well.
So I feel like, an AI story, the demand, but that whole supply, it comes down to basics, supply and demand, right? There's just so much demand. There's just so much supply. Prices go up, and as you said, plays into why the revenue numbers are higher, why the margins are better. So does this necessarily, I guess, then does confirm the AI boom story? Or how do we have to be smart as we read through?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a little bit complicated simply because AI is sort of a structural supply limiter right now for the industry, for the memory industry. What we need to see is whether or not these companies decide to invest in capacity. If they invest in more capacity, which they are to some degree, technology upgrades, but really like adding to the shells that they have now, and if they decide in the future to expand to more shell capacity.
What does that mean, shell capacity?
So basically, I got a little technical, but basically just in manufacturing lines, how many wafers they can run through all of their total manufacturing facilities. So if they add more wafer capacity, they can basically the supply and demand dynamic will improve a lot, and there won't be as much of a supply crunch.
Do they want to do that, or do they like that they can charge more and their margins are like, whoa?
That's the question, is how long do they allow a supply crunch to occur, because they have incentive to have very strong margins, but with such a
there's
supply,
also cycles, right? We always get this from Ian King, that there are cycles
with such a supply crunch, though. The thing is, at some point, someone wants to take market share as well.
Like a Samsung?
Yeah, Samsung has really strong opportunities to do that because they have such amount of leverage. They have so much more available capacity relative to the other players in the market, like Hynix and Micron.
But politically, in an administration such as this, that's quote unquote America first, does Micron have a better opportunity? Like, is there a U.S. competitor, or is Samsung the biggest competitor?
No, there's really not. I mean, it's mostly Korean, Chinese, and so for the most part, they don't really have a major advantage in that sense. I think. They have a limited amount of capacity. If I were just to look at HBM specifically, even if NVIDIA wanted to source all of their HBM from Micron or asked to, Micron can't really supply all of it right now. But ultimately, NVIDIA and other AI server makers are going to want to diversify their supply. It's a commodity-like business. HBM is a lot less commodity-like, but at the end of the day, the differences between some of these products is it's not as extreme as what you would see between different types of GPUs, for example.
So what's the number one question we should be asking Micron, like on the call today?
I think the biggest question is just going to be, there is a supply crunch right now. There's not enough. There's a lot of demand. There's not enough supply. At what point can we expect to see capacity start to increase across the industry? What's the discipline that Micron maintains in order to sustain strong pricing and margins?
Right, because I feel like when we talk with Ian King, and he talks about the semiconductor cycles, and then there's always at some point an imbalance where there's a lot more demand, and then there's the build out, and then all of a sudden you have a lot more supply, and then prices go down.
We just don't know where we are in the cycle.
Right, and so. And I think with the questions that are out there, especially when it comes to the AI side of things, I would assume companies are going to be very cautious.
Yeah, we are getting past the point
before doing too much build out.
Yeah, we're getting past the point of historical precedence in terms of the length of up cycles. Tends to peak around 10 quarters, and we're definitely getting beyond that now. And so the question just becomes, how disciplined are these companies going forward?